As we get closer and closer to Labor Day weekend and the early fall, both Jane and I find ourselves drawn to a book about the empty nest syndrome. Perhaps some of you have already been there and done that a few times over, but first time round, it is a little bit anxiety creating, particularly when your third born has decided that he wants to venture out to Australia. Not just go to Guelph like some of his friends, or even to New York City like some of his other friends, but Australia, which I think is sort of around the other side of the globe somewhere. And he's going by himself, and traveling all those miles and doing all sorts of things outside the control of his parents. And yes, it does cause a little bit of anxiety in the form of parents. That sense that we have that things are happening that are bigger than we can control in life hits each one of us in different ways. Whether it's the empty nest syndrome with a child heading out to new adventures in life, university or college or other adventures like Australia or New York City or other things that lie before us. We all encounter moments in our lives when the situations and the circumstances round about us seem greater than we can handle. Seem greater than we can handle. I was saying this, expressing some of this thought to my very wise wife on the phone this week, as she's down at the cottage in Nova Scotia, not worrying about anything, the maritime breezes and such. And she said, "Harvey, you have to remember, when the circumstances get bigger, our faith in God has to also get bigger." God gives us our wives for a real good reason to be wisdom, right, Jim? When our circumstances get bigger, our faith needs to get bigger. And that's exactly what we encounter in our lessons today, both in the Old Testament and into the New Testament. The story of Jeremiah's call is certainly exactly that. Here we have a young man. It's either the references to his age would put him either as a child or perhaps a youth. Calls to mind the story of Samuel, who was given by his mother into the care in the temple to become an apprentice priest. Well, the same thing has happened to Jeremiah as a young man. Somehow or other, he has become a very young apprentice priest in the temple in Jerusalem. But in a time that was, in a circumstance that was most difficult, both for him, but also for the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel had been invaded in earlier centuries by the Assyrians, and now they find themselves invaded in the north by the Babylonians and in the south by the Egyptians. And as a small army, they were trying to fend off both north and southern boundaries, and they were losing on both fronts. Their king had been killed by the Egyptians. The Babylonians were coming down from the north, about to take all the nation into captivity. And there, in the midst of this overwhelming circumstance in which the people of God seem to be about to be crushed and wiped off the face of the earth, we meet this young priest, this young minister, perhaps just a teenager. And he goes and he does what is expected of him as a young priest, as a young minister in the temple, goes and offers some sacrifices, perhaps intercedes for God's people in prayer. And yet he looks out on the circumstances around him, around the people of God at that moment in history, and I'm sure he was crying out in total anxiety and stress. "Oh God, what is going to become of me in the midst of this circumstance? What is going to become of your people in the midst of this overwhelming circumstance?" He cries out to God, "This is too big for me. This is too big for me to handle, oh God." And he cries, I'm sure, with tears in his prayers, "Oh God, how can we get through this moment?" And the word comes back to him, the very word of God, directly to him as a young man, and says, "You don't have to be big enough to handle this. All you have to do is trust in me. First of all, you need to allow my word to be your word. Don't worry whether you have enough to say or anything to say at all, or the right thing to do. I am going to take charge of your very words, God says to Jeremiah. My words will be your words to the people of God. And those words will be beyond anything you can imagine or even that the people of Israel can imagine. My word will come to them and will say, don't forget who I am. In the midst of this overwhelming circumstance of pending captivity, pending invasion, destruction of all of the nation of God's people, I want you to stand up in the midst of those overwhelming circumstances and say, the God of Jacob is still the King of kings and Lord of lords. The God who I serve is still the majestic, awesome God that holds all things together as he brought all things into being. The God I serve is the God who is the king of even Babylon, the Lord of the Babylonians. The God who I serve is the Lord and the king over even the Egyptians. The God who I serve is still the King of kings and Lord of lords, even though things seem absolutely out of control. The King I serve is still the King that holds all the nations of the world in his hands. He is able to tear them down or to destroy them, or he's able to build them up and plant them. He is the King of kings and Lord of lords. And I, Jeremiah, am simply his mouthpiece. I don't have to have it all together. I don't have to have it all in control. I simply need to be a person of faith and trusting this impossible circumstance to the Lord of lords and King of kings. What God was simply saying to Jeremiah, this young man seeking to follow God with all that he had, was simply saying you need to have a bigger view of what is going on. A bigger view than seeing just the circumstances that you are going through at this moment in your lives. And what you need to see is that God is still in control. Despite how hopeless things may seem, young Jeremiah, I am still the King of kings and Lord of lords. And the amazing thing about that is that it allowed Jeremiah to simply be himself. But in being himself, to also be the agent of God's purpose and plan for his people. He was allowed to be the youth, or perhaps the child that he was, but in faith to allow God to speak to his people through him. To get the bigger picture that God is in control no matter what the circumstances. Really, in many ways, the very same situation faced the early Christians that receive, perhaps written by Paul or some other unknown author, the letter to the Hebrews, one of the latter books in the New Testament. It is written again to a group, a scattered few of the early church across the Roman Empire who are facing great difficulty. We don't know the exact circumstance. Perhaps it was the persecutions of Nero or the other Roman emperors. Perhaps it was just the experience of being thrown out of their synagogues as Christian believers now by the Jewish leaders that did not want to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. No matter what they were going through or whatever it was that they were going through, it had brought them to the point, too, of saying, our circumstances are greater than what we can handle. Our circumstances are bigger than what we can handle in our own strength. We've been thrown out of the synagogues. Perhaps we've been thrown all over the Roman Empire. If this is written in the midst of the experience of 70 AD, the Roman conquest of Jerusalem, and the scattering of Jewish believers all over the Roman Empire, they are facing an overwhelming circumstance. And just the very same message applies to what they are going through. They need to grasp the bigger picture, that even though their circumstances seem overwhelming, that God is still God, that God is still the Lord of lords and King of kings.